right. Hello, everybody. We are on to fantasy lesson number 9. And today, our objective is to compare themes in fantasy with themes that occur in history. So, um, I want you to think about some of the themes that you've seen across many books. Because some themes are so important and so universal that you will find them in more than one book, and you will even find them in history. So in a moment, I'm going to zoom out here and I'm going to show you a chart, and we're going to talk about some of the people in our history and how we could talk about them like we've talked about our fantasy books. So let's take a moment and think about history. Because we study history to understand the past so that we can do better in our present and our future. So, you have spent a lot of time studying American history this year, and my hope is that you've learned a lot of lessons about how ordinary people can make a big difference. So, let's take a look at a few historical characters. George Washington. What did he accomplish? Well, he unified the American army. He beat the British. What was his quest? His quest was to win out against the British. He wanted a bigger army. And what were his dragons? Well, it was very cold. They were very hungry at Valley Forge. He had to get people to support the fight and really believe in it and inspire them. Let's talk about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, her accomplishments, she was one person that was instrumental in getting civil rights passed, right? Although we know there have been other people who also helped with this, Rosa Parks was instrumental in the movement. What was her quest? She wanted equality for buses, for school, and she wanted desegregation. Remember, is segregation is when people are separated. So desegregation means to unseparate them. So to make sure that black people don't live in one neighborhood and white people live in another. I would suggest that we still have a lot of work to do on desegregation. Dragons. What were some of her dragons? Segregation, which is still a dragon now, racism, which is still a dragon now, and ignorance. Ignorance is a nice way to say stupidity. When people don't know other things that are different than them, sometimes people are fearful. Sometimes people are ignorant, and the fear of not knowing something makes people act pretty silly. Let's look at Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, what did she accomplish? Well, she freed some slaves, right? She ran the Underground Railroad, which isn't actually a railroad. It was a system to free slaves, bring them to the North. What was her quest? Well, to get to the North, escape the South and slavery, and not just for herself, right? She did that for herself, and then she went back many, many times and supported other people. What were her dragons? Hatred. There's a lot of hatred during the time. Branding. Branding is what we do to cows. If I was a farmer and I had my set of cows, I might take a hot metal iron, heat it up, and then stick it on my animal so that basically it's like a tattoo that says it belongs to me. They were doing that to humans. Lynching. Lynching is hanging people. And slavery, which we all know what that is. So those were some of her dragons. Now, let's think about our characters that we are studying in our story. What have they accomplished? What are their quests? And what are their dragons? Now, I really admire these three people we've talked about, but ordinary people, which Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and George Washington are, they were just ordinary people who really rose to the challenge of their quests, right? So let's talk about a few themes that you might find in history that you might also find in your fantasy novels. Because some themes are so important that we will find them in many places. All right, so let's talk about some common universal themes. Common means it happens often. Universal, it means it applies across many different genres. It is something that is applied across all humans, generally speaking. And themes, we've been talking about a lot of different themes. Themes are the message that the author hopes you take away from their story. So one theme that is universal is kids grow up fast in times of trouble. We think about many different people in history, young people who have had to push themselves and grow up in times of trouble. Think about yourselves growing up in the pandemic. You've had to accept things, change, grow. Even if you didn't want to, you don't really have a choice because there is trouble, and if you don't accept it, you will be in trouble, right? Even ordinary people or minor characters can affect events. I think this is really important because sometimes we feel very helpless. And when we look at history, we realize there have been a lot of amazing people who have really made a huge difference. And this goes with the same thing. Ordinary people can be capable of great courage. You know, we spend a lot of time watching the Marvel movies. We spend a lot of time looking at superheroes. But in all actuality, those are based on real live humans, right? People are capable of being very brave. Next, when people band together, they can build power to change. So, band together means unite. So, when people unite, when they come together, they collectively can cause change. We are much stronger as a large group than we are individually. And as we've talked about in our class, we've talked about how our culture is very individualistic, right? We worry about the individual, we worry about being unique, we worry about being who am I and what is my place in the world. But one thing that we forget to focus on in our culture is the collective, because we are stronger together. And so if we focus on what do we want to accomplish all together, it will help us keep in perspective on our own individualism, right? We don't want to become too selfish because if we are too selfish, we cause problems. Same thing is happening in your fantasy novels. The same thing has happened in history. Where where there is power, there is also resistance. So think about places of power. You can also think about power is synonymous with magic in some of your books. Power can be the leaders. Power can be the president, the governor, the teacher, the parent, the older sibling. Power can be a virus. Power can come in many different forms. It's important to think about power, though, because power is what shapes a lot of our challenges. And so when they say when there is power, there is resistance, resistance means pushing against the power. So, for example, since many people during the pandemic are asked to shelter in place for the common good of others, there are groups of people who are having rallies out and fighting against this. And so they would be an example of resistance. Many people have a hard time with change. So when something is different, many people flip out and fight against it. Whether or not the change is good or bad, it oftentimes does not matter. People a lot of times have trouble with change. And our last one, humans are capable of great evil to each other and great goodness. Yeah. I mean, when we look at history and how our culture has treated people of color, it's great evil. As you noticed from American history, a lot of the racism started as a way to make money, to become rich. So, exploiting, taking advantage of people for our own individual wealth, that's evil as far as I'm concerned, and I would hope to you as well. Um, and so now when we look at systemic racism, that's the system of racism that we have in our country right now and in our past, there's still a lot of evil in that. The fact that a person of color was just shot for no reason, that that is just evil. But luckily, we're also capable of a really amazing goodness. When I look at the community that we're in, and I see all the generosity, I see all the love, I see all the support, I see people going out of their ways to help and support one another. That is beautiful. That is what we all hope to be, right? I'm very inspired by that. And so we have to pay close attention to that because humans are capable of both. We have a limited capacity and a limited amount of energy. So, how do we want to spend our energy? Do we want it to break down people or do we want it to build people up? So, we're going to listen to chapters 18 and 19 in The Thief of Always. I want you to think about these common universal themes in The Thief of Always as you're hearing the story. Then I will talk to you briefly about some of these themes that I've noticed. All right.
In his coffin. Then he threw the rocks aside and hauled off the lid. Chapter 18. The Bitter Truth. He almost shouted out loud, seeing the terrible state that poor Mrs. Griffin was in. She was staring up at him with wild eyes, her hair pulled out in clawfuls, her face purple with bruises. A foul rag had been stuffed into her mouth. Harvey carefully removed it, and she began to speak, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Thank you, my sweet, thank you," she said. "But oh, you shouldn't have come back. It's too dangerous here." "Who did this to you?" "Jive and Rictus." "But he ordered it, didn't he?" Harvey said, helping her up. "Don't tell me he's dead, because I know that doesn't matter. Hood's here in the house, isn't he?" "Yes," she said, holding on to him as she climbed up out of the box. "Yes, he's here, but not in the way you think." She began to weep, the tears clogging her words. "It's all right," Harvey said. "Everything's going to be all right." Her fingers went up to her face and touched the tears. I thought I'd never cry again," she said. "Look what you've done." "I'm sorry," said Harvey. "Oh, no, my sweet, don't be sorry. It's wonderful." She smiled through her tears. "You've broken his curse on me." "What curse?" "Oh, it's a long story." "I want to hear." "I was the first child who ever came to Hood's house," she said. "This was many, many years ago. I was 9 when I first walked up the front path. I'd run away from home, you see." "Why?" "My cat had died, and my father refused to buy me another. And what do you think Rictus gave me the very day I arrived?" "3 cats," said Harvey. "You know how this house works, don't you?" Harvey nodded. "It gives you whatever you think you want." "And I wanted cats, and a home, and—" "What?" "Another father." She shivered with fear, remembering the horror. "I met Hood that night. At least, I heard his voice." Stu Cat had come to her feet, and she paused to stoop and gather the creature into her arms. "Where did you hear him?" Harvey asked. "In the attic at the top of the house. And he said to me, 'If you stay here forever and ever, you'll never die. You'll grow old, but you'll live until the end of time and never weep again.'" "And that's what you wanted?" "It was stupid, but yes, I did. I was afraid, you see, afraid of being put into the ground like my cat." A new wave of tears came, running down her pale cheeks. "I was running away from death." "Straight into its house," Harvey said. "Oh, no, child," Mrs. Griffin said. "Hood isn't death." She wiped away her tears so as to see Harvey more clearly. "Death is a natural thing. Hood isn't. I would welcome death now, like a friend I'd driven away from my door. I've seen too much, my sweet. Too many seasons, too many children." "Why didn't you try and stop him?" "I have no power against him. All I could do was give the children who came here as much happiness as I knew how." "So, how old are you?" Harvey asked her. "Who knows?" she replied, laying her cheek against Stu Cat's fur. "I grew up and old in a matter of days, but then the passage of time seemed to lose its hold on me. Sometimes I've wanted to ask one of the children, 'What year is it in the world outside?' I can tell you." "Don't," she said, putting her finger to her lips. "I don't want to know how the years have flown. It would hurt too much." "What do you want, then?" "To die," she said, with a little smile. "To slip out of this skin and go to the stars." "Is that what happens?" "It's what I believe," she said. "But Hood won't let me die. Not ever. That'll be his revenge on me for helping you to escape. He already had Blue Cat murdered for showing you the way out." "Hood's going to let you go," Harvey said. "I promise. I'm going to make him." She shook her head. "You're so brave, my sweet," she said. "But he won't let any of us go. There's such a terrible emptiness inside him. He wants to fill it with souls, but it's a pit, a bottomless pit." "And you're both heading for it," said an oily voice. The speaker was Mar. She was oozing down the stairs. "We've been looking for you up and down," she said to Harvey. "You'd better come with me, child." She extended her arms in Harvey's direction. He remembered all too well her transforming touch. "Come, come," she said. "I might still get you out of trouble if you let me make something humble of you. He likes humble things, does Mr. Hood. Fleas, worms, scabby dogs. Come to me, child, quickly." Harvey looked around the cellar. There were no other ways out. If he was to get Mrs. Griffin up into the sun, it had to be by way of the stairs, and Mar was standing in front of them. He took a step in her direction. She smiled toothlessly. "Good, child, good," she said. "Don't," Mrs. Griffin said. "She'll hurt you." "Hush, woman," Mar said. "We're going to have to nail that lid down next time." Her greasy green eyes swiveled back in Harvey's direction. "He knows what's good for him, don't you, boy?" Harvey didn't reply. He simply kept walking toward Mar, whose fingers seemed to be growing like a snail's horns, reaching out to fix upon his face. "You've been such an obedient boy," Mar went on. "Maybe I won't turn you into a worm after all. What would you like to be? Tell me what's in your heart." "Never mind my heart," Harvey said, reaching out toward Mar. "What about yours?" A puzzled look came over Mar's face. "Mine?" she said. "Yes," said Harvey. "What do you dream of being?" "I never dream," she said defiantly. "You should try it," Harvey told her. "If you can change me into a worm or a bat, what could you do for yourself?" The defiance on her face became bafflement, and the bafflement turned to panic. Her outstretched fingers began to retreat into themselves. Harvey reached for them like lightning, however, interweaving his fingers with hers. "What do you want to be?" he said to her. "Think!" She started to struggle, and he felt her magic surging through her fingers into his, attempting to work some change on him. But he didn't want to be a vampire bat anymore, and he certainly didn't want to be a worm. He was quite happy to be himself. The magic, therefore, had no hold on him. Instead, it flowed back into Mar, who began to shake as though she were being dipped in icy water. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Tell me what's in your heart," he said, returning her invitation. "I'm not telling you," she replied, still trying to wrest her fingers free of his. But she was not used to having her victims resist her this way. Her muscles were soft and flabby. She pulled and pulled, but she couldn't escape him. "Leave me alone," she said. "If you harm me, Mr. Hood will have your head." "I'm not harming you," Harvey replied. "I'm just letting you have your dreams, the way you let me have mine." "I don't want them," she yelled, struggling more than ever. He wouldn't let her go. Instead, he drew closer to her, as if to wrap her up in his arms. She started to spit at him, great gobs of slime, but he wiped them from his face and kept approaching her. "No," she began to murmur. "No." But she couldn't keep the magic she'd intended for him from working on her own skin and bones. Her fat face began to soften and run like melting wax. Her body sagged in its ragged coat, and a greenish gruel began to pour out onto the floor. "Oh," she sobbed, "you damnable child." What dream was this, Harvey wondered, that was turning Mar to mush? She was growing smaller all the time, her clothes dropping off her as her body shrank, her voice becoming thin. It could only be moments before she disappeared altogether. "What do you dream about?" Harvey said, as Mar's fingers ran away between his own like brackish water. I dream of nothing, Ma replied, her eyes sinking back into her disintegrating skull. And that's what I've become. She was almost lost in the folds of her clothes. Nothing, she said again. She was no more than a dirty puddle now, a puddle with a fading voice. Nothing. Then she was gone, devoured by her own magic. You did it, Mrs. Griffin said. Child, you did it. 1 down, 3 to go, Harvey said. 3? Rictus, Jive, and Hood himself. You're forgetting Karna. Is it still alive? Mrs. Griffin nodded. I'm afraid I've heard its shrieks every night. It wants revenge. And I want my life back, Harvey said, taking her by the arm and escorting her, still carrying Stu Cat, to the bottom of the stairs. I'm going to get it, Mrs. Griffin. Whatever it takes, I'm going to get it. Mrs. Griffin glanced back at the heap of clothes that marked the place where Mar had vanished into thin air. Maybe you can, she said, with astonishment in her voice. Of all the children who've come here, maybe you're the one who can beat Hood at his own game. Chapter 19. Dust to Dust. Rictus was waiting at the top of the stairs. His smile was sweet. His words were not. You're a murderer now, my little man, he said. Do you like the feel of Mar's blood on your hands? He didn't kill her, Mrs. Griffin said. She was never alive. None of you are. What are we then? Rictus asked. Illusions, Harvey replied, ushering Mrs. Griffin and her cat past Rictus to the front door. It's all illusions. Rictus followed them, giggling insanely. What's so funny? Harvey said, opening the door to let Mrs. Griffin out into the sun. You are, Rictus replied. You think you know everything, but you don't know Mr. Hood. I will in a little while, said Harvey. Go and get warm, he told Mrs. Griffin. I'll be back. Be careful, child, she said. I will, he told her, then closed the door. You're a strange one, Rictus said, his smile failing a little. His face, when his teeth no longer dazzled, was like a mask made of dough. 2 thumbholes for eyes and a blob for a nose. I could suck out your brains through your ears, he said, all the music gone from his voice. Maybe you could, said Harvey, but you're not going to. How do you know? Because I've got an appointment with your master. He started toward the bottom of the stairs, but before he reached it, a dark figure flitted in front of him. It was Jive, and he was carrying a plate of apple pie and ice cream. It's a long climb, he said. Put something in your stomach first. Harvey looked down at the plate. The pie was golden brown and dusted with sugar, the ice cream melting in a sweet, white pool. It certainly looked tempting. Go on, said Jive. You deserve a treat. No thanks, Harvey told him. Why not? Jive wanted to know, turning full circle on his heel. It's lighter than I am. But I know what it's made of, Harvey said. Apples and cinnamon and... No, said Harvey. I know what it's really made of. He looked back at the pie, and for a moment it seemed he glimpsed the truth of the thing, the gray dust and ashes from which this illusion was made. You think it's poisoned? Jive said. Is that it? Maybe, Harvey replied, still staring at the pie. Well, it's not, Jive said, and I'll prove it. Harvey heard Rictus make a warning sound behind him, but Jive didn't catch it. He plunged his fingers into the pie and ice cream and delivered them to his mouth in one swift motion. As he closed his mouth, Rictus said, Don't swallow it. Again, too late. The food went down in one gulp. An instant later, Jive dropped the plate and began to slam his fists against his stomach, as if to force the food up again. But instead of half-chewed pie, a cloud of dust issued from between his teeth. Then another. Then another. Half-blinded, Jive snatched at Harvey's throat. "What have you done?" he coughed. Harvey had no difficulty shaking himself free. "It's all dust," he said. "Dirt and dust and ashes. All the food, all the presents, everything." "Help me," Jive said, clawing at his mouth. "Somebody help me." "There's no help for you now," came a solemn voice. Harvey looked around. It was Rictus who had spoken, and he was retreating across the hallway, his hands clamped to his face. He stared at Jive between his fingers, his teeth chattering as he voiced the horrid truth. "You shouldn't have eaten that pie," he said. "It's reminding your belly of what you're made of." "What's that?" Jive said. "What the boy says," Rictus replied. "Dirt and ashes." Jive threw back his head, howling "No!" at this. But even as he opened his mouth to deny it, the truth came pouring forth. Dry streams of dust that ran from his gullet and flowed over his fingers. It was like a fatal message being passed from one part of his body to another. Touched by the dust, his fingers began to crumple in their turn, and as they dropped, the same whisper of decay spread to his thighs and knees and feet. He started to drop to the ground, but with a final pirouette, swung himself around and grabbed hold of the banister. "Save me!" he yelled up the stairs. "Mr. Hood, can you hear me? Please, please, save me!" His legs crumbled beneath him now, but he refused to give up. He started to haul himself up the stairs, still yelling for Mr. Hood to heal him. There was no reply from the heights of the house, however, nor any sound now from Rictus. There were only Jive's pleas and wheezings, and the hiss of dust as it ran away down the stairs from the emptying sack of his body. "What's going on?" Wendell said, appearing from the kitchen with ketchup smeared around his mouth. He stared at the cloud of dust that hung around the stairs, unable to see the creature at its heart. Harvey was closer to the cloud, however, and so was witness to Jive's last terrible moments. The dying creature reached up with an almost fingerless hand, still hoping, even as its life drifted away, that its creator would come to save it. Then it sank down upon the stairs, and its last pitiful fragments crumbled. "Somebody been beating the carpets?" Wendell said, as Jive's dust settled. "Two down," Harvey murmured to himself. "What did you say?" Wendell wanted to know. Before he replied, Harvey glanced around the hallway looking for Rictus. But Hood's third servant had disappeared. "It doesn't matter," Harvey said. "Are you done eating?" "Yeah." "Was the food good?" Wendell grinned. "Yeah." Harvey shook his head. "What does that mean?" Wendell asked. Harvey was on the verge of saying, "It means you can't help me. It means I have to go up and face Mr. Hood on my own." But what was the use? The house had claimed Wendell entirely. He'd be more of a hindrance than a help in the battle ahead. So instead he said, "Mrs. Griffin's outside." "So we found her?" "We found her." "I'll go say hi," Wendell said with a cheery smile. "Good idea." Wendell had his hand on the door when he turned and said, "Where will you be?" But Harvey didn't answer. He'd already climbed past the heap of dust that marked Jive's demise, and was nearing the top of the first flight, on his way to meet the power that lay waiting in the darkness of the attic.
Okay, so this one's getting a little long, so let me wrap this up quickly. All right, so what I want us to do is think about the common universal themes that we've seen in The Thief of Always really quickly. So kids grow up fast in times of trouble. I would argue that Harvey has grown up a lot, right? He started off feeling uninspired, kind of lazy, and now he's going back and trying to save people who he did not know at the beginning of the story. Even ordinary people or minor characters can affect events, for sure. Harvey is making big changes in this story. Ordinary people can be capable of great courage. He's impressively courageous in this part of the story. I was almost like, wow. It seemed a little bit unbelievable how courageous he was, but yet impressive. When people band together, they can build power to change. Well, you might notice that Wendell is just off eating. And Harvey doesn't seem to mind. He knows who his partner is. He knows his capabilities. He's not holding it against him. And yet he's doing this all by himself. Where there is power, there's also resistance. Well, there's a lot of power in the Holiday House, and Harvey is the resistance to it. And you notice that he is fighting the creatures in the Holiday House with their own magic. He's turning their power on them, and that seems to be working. And then the other one is humans are capable of great evil to each other and great goodness. So in the story, we have seen a lot of the four in the Holiday House to be quite evil. I would argue that Harvey has been mostly good, but like all people, no one's perfect, right? Harvey has not been perfect. Wendell also, he's a lot of good. He hasn't been perfect either, though, because nobody is. People make mistakes, but then we reflect, think about it, and try to get back on course. So what I want you to do is think about in your story, the series that you are reading, what themes do you notice in your story that might be similar to history? Like, for example, Narnia was written during World War II. And so a lot of the references are based on the sentiments that were happening at the time. So think about your story. Does it have any connection to history? Does it have connections to the themes in history? And if so, what does it tell us about the story and what does it tell us about now? Okay? All right, get to work.